The first scan came back corrupted. That was my initial conclusion. I wrote it in the margin of my working log in shorthand, the way a researcher does when they already know what happened and only need a note to remind themselves later. Instrument fault, rerun in the morning. I set the tablet down. I went to the feeding alcove and ate my evening meal and did not think about it again until the morning shift, when I ran the scan a second time and the numbers were identical. Not similar, identical down to the fourth decimal. I remember staring at those two readouts side by side, the first run and the second run, separated by 8 hours of what we had done to detainee 7, and feeling something I did not yet have a word for. It was not alarm. Not yet. It was the specific cognitive friction that happens when an experienced scientist encounters data that cannot be what it appears to be, and knows, nonetheless, that the instrument is not lying. That feeling has a name, I have since learned. I learned it from a human. They call it the O moment. The moment before understanding arrives, when the brain has already processed the consequence but the conscious mind has not yet caught up. I will describe what we did to detainee 7. I will describe it in full because the tribunal has asked me to, and because I believe the full description is necessary for the record to mean anything. I am aware that portions of this account will be difficult to hear. I ask the tribunal's patience. My name is Verathaln of the Keshari Institute for Adversarial Xenobiology. My rank is Senior Analytic Examiner, 3rd bracket. I have held that rank for 22 years. Prior to the Keshari Institute, I spent 11 years as a field biometric officer with the Outer Survey, which means I have run stress response profiles on 41 distinct sapient species. 41. The tribunal should understand what that represents. 8 years of field deployment, 37 planetary systems, subjects ranging from the semi-aquatic Pelvorath, whose entire nervous system is essentially an open threat sensor, to the Gandhari, who have 6 distinct stress response pathways operating simultaneously, to the Hurekshin collective consciousness, which experiences individual stress only as a fraction of total hive disturbance. I have seen what biological dread looks like in many forms. I know what the body does when it believes it is going to die. I am testifying today because the tribunal needs to understand what detainee 7's body did instead. The human had been in our custody for 3 days before the study formally began. We held it in Containment Suite 9 on Sublevel 4 of the Keshari Annex, a facility designed for exactly this kind of long-duration psychophysical profiling. The suite was comfortable by galactic median standards, temperature regulated, adequate light cycle, nutrition delivered on a predictable schedule. We were not running a deprivation study. We wanted a clean baseline before we introduced stressors. The baseline itself was the first surprise, though we did not recognize it as one at the time. The human's resting cardiac rhythm was 44 beats per standard interval. For the tribunal's reference, the galactic median resting rate for sapient species of comparable body mass is between 80 and 110 beats per standard interval. Some of the faster metabolisms, like the Orvathi, run as high as 140. 44 would be, in a Keshari subject, a medical emergency, the kind of rate we associate with deep sedation or the early stages of cardiac failure. In the human, it was simply Tuesday. We noted this. We filed it in the intake survey under baseline anomalies, cardiovascular, and moved on. We had other measurements to take. The human's cortisol analog concentration. We had mapped its endocrine system by then, at least well enough to identify which compounds tracked with arousal and threat response, was at rest, approximately 63 nanounits per measurement volume. For reference, in a Keshari under ordinary working conditions, not even distress, just ordinary cognitive effort, we run approximately 220. The Orvathi under ordinary conditions run closer to 400. The human at rest, in an unfamiliar containment environment, separated from every member of its species, was at 63. My junior colleague Dim suggested the mapping was incorrect. She argued we had misidentified the compound. I told her to run it again with the secondary protocol. She did. It came back at 63. She filed it and said nothing else. I want to be precise about the timeline because the tribunal deserves precision. Day 1 through Day 3, baseline measurement. Day 4, first stress protocol, which I will describe. Day 5 through Day 31, escalating protocols, which I will also describe. Day 32, the final scan, which is the data at the center of this proceeding. Day 4, first protocol. We introduced acoustic stress, sustained sound at frequencies. Our preliminary neurological survey indicated the human's auditory cortex processed as aversive. We used tones calibrated to the upper range of what the human's hearing could register, sustained at a volume sufficient to be uncomfortable rather than physically damaging. We are not a punitive institution. The study was physiological, not disciplinary. The duration of the first acoustic session was 4 continuous standard hours. I was watching the biometric feed from the observation booth. The human was sitting in the center of the containment suite, on the sleeping platform, with its legs crossed and its hands resting on its knees. After approximately 20 standard minutes, it tilted its head to one side as if listening, not flinching, not pressing its hands against its auditory organs, listening, as if the sustained aversive tone were a piece of music it was trying to parse. After 40 standard minutes, it lay down. I ran a biometric snapshot at the 40-minute mark. The cortisol analog was at 71, up 8 points from resting baseline. For reference, Dim's cortisol analog when I told her the acoustic protocol was running 4 hours, not when she experienced the sound, simply when I told her the duration was at 340. The human inside the noise was at 71. It was asleep within the hour, confirmed by neural oscillation readout, the slow, cycling signature that every sapient species we have studied produces during restorative sleep. The sound continued. The human slept through it. At the 3-hour mark, I lowered the volume by 15% because I was concerned the readings were still instrument error, and I wanted to rule out a hardware fault in the auditory stress emitter. The volume reduction made no measurable difference to the sleep pattern. The human was genuinely asleep. I did not write instrument fault in my log that night. I wrote, re-examine auditory sensitivity mapping, possible misidentification of aversive frequency range for this species. I was still, at that point, constructing explanations that kept my prior model intact. This is normal scientific behavior. It is also, in retrospect, exactly the wrong reflex to have in the presence of a human. Day 5. We ran the acoustic protocol again. Same parameters. 6 hours this time rather than 4. The human's cortisol analog peaked at 74 in the first hour and settled back to 68 by the third. It did not sleep this time. It sat in its stillness posture for most of the session and appeared, as far as the feed allowed us to assess, to be thinking. Not distressed, thinking. After the session concluded, I checked the intake paperwork one more time, specifically the notes from the field team that had brought the human to us. The field team lead had written, in the summary section, that the subject had been cooperative during transfer, had asked a number of questions about the facility and the process that the team had not been authorized to answer, and had responded to this lack of information by, and I quote directly from the report, appearing to make a decision, and then settling down. That phrase had not struck me as notable on first reading. By day 5 it had begun to. Day 6. Sleep deprivation protocol. I want to be clear that sleep deprivation, as a research methodology, is fully sanctioned under the Institute's ethical review framework when the subject is not a protected sapient. The human status at the time of the study was unclassified sapient, which is not, I acknowledge, a category that reflects well on the Institute's intake procedures, and I have stated so in my formal review. I am not here to defend the classification. I am here to describe what the data showed. We interrupted the human's sleep at regular intervals across a continuous 90 standard hour period. Automated interruption system, precise timing. Every 2 hours, lights, sound. A brief physical vibration in the sleeping platform, not violent, not damaging, simply enough to prevent sustained deep sleep. After 12 hours, the human's cortisol analog was at 88, up from 63. Still, for context, well below what Sarat-Dim registers on a routine workday. After 36 hours, it was at 97. After 72 hours, 3 full standard days of fragmented, interrupted sleep, it was at 104. I presented these numbers to my department supervisor, second bracket examiner Peleth-4, who looked at them for a long moment and then asked me if I had cross-validated the hormone mapping against the secondary protocol. I told him yes, 3 times now. He asked if there were any signs of behavioral dysregulation in the subject. I told him that over the 72 hours of interrupted sleep, the human had requested additional nutrition twice through the containment suite's communication panel, paced the room for approximately 3 hours in total across all sessions, performed what appeared to be a series of structured physical movements each morning that our behavioral analysis unit classified as deliberate exercise, and spent a substantial portion of its waking time staring at the ceiling. Staring at the ceiling, Peleth-4 repeated. Resting its eyes on the ceiling, I said. It is difficult to read expression in these subjects. It did not appear to be in distress. Peleth-4 said, Verathon, a Keshari research subject at 72 hours of interrupted sleep would be in the early stages of cognitive decoherence. They would be exhibiting disorganized behavior, elevated thermal signature, marked motor instability. What does this subject's thermal signature show? I pulled the chart. The human's thermal signature, across the entire 72-hour period, had fluctuated less than 2 degrees from its resting baseline. Peleth-4 stared at the chart for a long time. Then he said, continue the study, expand the protocol range. I want full daily readouts on my desk. Day 8. The tribunal has asked about the communication log. I will address it now, since it is in evidence and the tribunal's second seat examiner raised it during the preliminary review. The communication panel in each containment suite allows subjects to submit text requests to the monitoring team. Most subjects use it rarely. Under stress conditions, usage typically increases as the subject attempts to negotiate or protest or, in the case of more cognitively sophisticated species, to attempt to understand what is being done to them and why. The human used it often, not to protest, to ask questions. Day 3 before protocols began. What is the schedule for meals? Can I have more light in the evening? Day 4 after the first acoustic session. Are you testing my hearing? I should tell you I can hear quite well if that helps your data. Day 6 during the sleep deprivation protocol. I notice the interruptions are exactly 2 standard hours apart. Is that deliberate? Day 7. I've been counting the interruptions. You've missed the pattern 3 times. Was that intentional or is the system having calibration issues? I want to pause on that last message, because the tribunal should understand what it represents. 7 days into a formal stress study, 72 hours into a sleep deprivation protocol, the human had detected the precise timing interval of the interruption system, noticed the 3 instances where the automated timer had drifted by a fraction of an interval, and was inquiring whether this was a deliberate methodological variable or a hardware problem, not as a taunt, as what appeared to be genuine scientific curiosity. I showed this message to Peleth-4. He read it twice. He said, "What did you reply?" I said, "I have not replied yet. I was not sure what to say." He said, "Tell it the calibration issues are being addressed." I said, "Is that true?" He said, "No, but tell it anyway." I sent the message. The human replied within the hour, "Thank you. The data would be cleaner with consistent timing, just so you know. Peleth Vor, reading over my shoulder, said, "It's helping us run the study." He did not say it with alarm. He said it the way a scientist says something when they have just observed a result that has not yet resolved into meaning, and the brain is still turning it over. Slowly, carefully, making sure it is actually seeing what it thinks it is seeing. Day 10. We introduced a new protocol layer alongside the sleep disruption, what our methodology framework designates as environmental conditioning. Level 2. Controlled unpredictability. The light cycle became irregular, not randomly, but in a pattern designed to be close enough to predictable that the subject would attempt to model it, and far enough from predictable that every model it built would eventually fail. Temperature fluctuated within a safe but uncomfortable range. The nutrition schedule was altered without notice, same nutritional content, but delivered at times that bore no relation to the established pattern. We were attempting to undermine the human's ability to orient in time. Social species rely heavily on routine as a psychological anchor. Remove the anchor without removing the species' need for one, and the species typically expends significant cognitive and endocrine resources attempting to reconstruct predictability from the chaos. That expenditure shows in the biology. The cortisol analog climbs. The stress response system stays activated because the world keeps presenting as uncertain, and uncertain is the signal the system evolved to treat as dangerous. On day 10, the human sent a message. The schedule seems to have changed. Is the variation intentional? I'm nodding it either way, but it would help to know if I should look for a new pattern or assume there isn't one. The human was asking us to tell it whether to expect predictability, so it could calibrate its own response accordingly. If we told it there was no pattern, it would stop looking for one and discharge the cognitive effort it was spending on the search. If we told it there was a pattern, it would keep looking, expending resources. I discussed this with Peleth Vor. He said to tell it there was no pattern. I said that doing so would actually reduce the protocol's effectiveness. He said, yes, but telling it there was a pattern when there wasn't would be an active deception, and we don't do that. I appreciated the distinction, even in that context. I told the human there was no pattern. It replied, understood, thank you. By day 10, the cortisol analog had reached 109. The sleep disruption and level 2 conditioning together had pushed it up further than the acoustic protocol alone had managed. This was progress, in the narrow sense that the baseline was rising. It was still less than half of Sarat-Dim's ordinary working day measurement. More relevantly, the human's communication log showed a notable change after day 10. It stopped asking about the protocols. It stopped asking us to clarify methodological choices. The questions shifted: food requests, a request for something to do, and then on day 12, the request that the tribunal's record has now documented. It asked whether we had anything to read. I think about that shift now. The human had spent 10 days attempting to understand the structure of what was being done to it, trying to model the system, trying to find the pattern, trying to ask the questions that would give it the information it needed to orient. When we told it there was no pattern, it processed that information, accepted it, and redirected. It stopped spending resources on a search that we had told it would not yield a result. It found something else to do with its mind. That is not the behavior of a system under pressure. That is the behavior of a system managing pressure. Day 14. By this point, the study had attracted attention from outside my department. 3 senior researchers from the Institute's Comparative Neuroendocrinology Division had requested observer access. Peleth Vor had granted it. I now had 4 colleagues watching the feeds alongside me, and none of them had explanations either. The cortisol analog on day 14 was 118. 10 days of continuous, escalating stress protocols, and the primary stress marker had risen from 63 to 118. A rise of 55 units. In absolute terms, this sounds significant. In context, on the same day, Sarat-Dim, who was by this point significantly disturbed by the nature of the study, and had requested a reassignment that Peleth-4 had not yet granted, measured at 890. I am not presenting Sarat-Dim's reading as a clinical comparison. I am presenting it because it is the only reference point that seems to land with colleagues who have not read the full study. You put those two figures side by side, 118 and 890, and something becomes very clear about the distance between what the human was experiencing and what it should, by any prior biological model, have been experiencing. One of the comparative neuroendocrinology observers, a researcher named Adav Seln, who is known to the tribunal, said quietly on day 14, "Is it possible this species simply does not have a classical stress response?" I said the hormone is present, the receptors map correctly, the cascade pathway exists, the response is there, it is simply contained. Contained, Adav Seln said. Compressed, as if there is a ceiling, as if the signal starts and then something catches it. None of us had a biological mechanism to account for that. Day 17. The peak measurement. I want the tribunal to have this on record. Day 17 was the most intensive thermal protocol we ran, sustained cold, below what the preliminary mapping suggested was the human's comfort threshold, though still well above any tissue damage threshold. We combined it with the sleep disruption, the level 2 conditioning, and a new acoustic layer. Not the steady tone we had used in early sessions, but a variable, irregular pattern of sounds, some aversive, some neutral, delivered unpredictably. Multiple simultaneous stressor channels, running continuously. The cortisol analog on day 17 was 131. This was the peak of the entire study, 131 nanounits, up from 63 on intake, a total rise of 68 units across 17 days of designed, escalating adversity. I want to make sure the tribunal has this framing. A Keshari researcher who is simply worried about a deadline runs at approximately 300. We had been running sustained protocols on this organism for 17 days, across acoustic, thermal, sleep, cognitive, and sensory disruption channels simultaneously, and the maximum reading we achieved was 131, which is, by the human's own species median range, which we had by this point begun to establish from the literature, within the normal operating band. We were doing our hardest work, and the human was still inside its own normal. Adav Seln said, when I showed him the day 17 peak, "We haven't found the bottom of the adaptation range. We've found the ceiling of our protocols." Day 20. An anomaly in the communication log that I want to enter for the record because the tribunal should have a complete picture. On day 20, the human sent a message that was different in register from all the previous ones. The previous messages had been practical questions, requests, polite acknowledgments. The day 20 message was, "I know you're watching, and I want you to know I'm not angry about this. I think you're trying to understand something. I hope the data is useful." I read that message 4 times. I showed it to Sarat-Dim. She read it and left the room for a while. I showed it to Adav Seln. He read it and said, "It's trying to reassure us." I said, "I know." He said, "That's either profound psychological stability or the most unsettling thing I've ever read in a subject communication log." I told him I was fairly certain it was both. Day 22. By this point, the study had been running for nearly 3 standard weeks. We had introduced what our framework calls level 4 aversive environmental conditioning, sustained and unpredictable disruption of every environmental parameter simultaneously, in a pattern specifically designed to be unlearnable. No routine, no predictability, no stimulus the subject could habituate to because the pattern kept changing. Every channel at once, irregular, with the explicit methodological intent of preventing adaptation. On day 22, after 3 days of level 4 protocols, the cortisol analog was 122, down from 131 on day 17. I will let that register for a moment. 5 days of the most intensive, comprehensive stress protocols our methodology framework contains, and the measurement was moving in the wrong direction from our study's perspective. Not because we had stopped, because the human had adapted faster than the escalation could follow. The neural trace data from day 22 is in evidence as Exhibit 7. I will summarize it. Starting on approximately day 19, the human had developed a practice of extended voluntary stillness. Seated, spine upright, breathing slow and regular, neural oscillation in a pattern between rest and active cognition. The comparative neuroendocrinology team identified this as a voluntary regulation state, not the involuntary discharge pattern other species show briefly under extreme stress. Deliberate, sustained, practiced. The human had learned, at some point in its development or prior experience, how to deliberately lower its own stress response from the inside, not as an emergency measure, as a habitual practice, something it did the way other species eat or sleep. We had been running level 4 protocols on it, and it was meditating. I will not pretend I responded to this professionally. I closed the neural trace window and sat with my back against the wall of the observation booth for approximately 4 standard minutes without doing anything. Saratdim sat down next to me without being asked and did not say anything, which I appreciated. Then I went back to the console and kept watching. Day 25. The human completed a self-directed exercise session, ate breakfast through the delivery panel, submitted a request through the communication system for additional data tablets if any were available, spent 90 minutes in stillness, spent 4 hours reading the second tablet of maintenance logs we had provided, spent 40 minutes in another exercise session, ate dinner, and went to sleep. Its cortisol analog across this day ranged between 112 and 117. I filed the daily report. Pelithvor read it and sent back a single line. What does it need to break? I did not have an answer. I am not certain the question has one. Day 28. I need to describe this day in full because it is directly relevant to the data at the center of this proceeding. On day 28, we introduced what our framework calls a proximate threat stimulus, a live encounter, not with a hostile organism, but with a controlled display of a biological threat analog, a containment unit holding a thresh specimen. The tribunal will be familiar with the thresh. They are apex predators native to the Ganori system. Their primary sensory system is tuned to detect the specific biochemical signature of sapient distress, the hormonal compounds released under acute fear. They hunt by fear. The more afraid the prey, the stronger the signal, the more certain the hunt. A thresh specimen placed adjacent to a containment suite is, for almost every sapient species studied, a reliable acute stress trigger because something in the prey neurology recognizes the threat at a precognitive level. Before the conscious mind has processed what it is seeing, the body has already fired. We introduced the thresh unit into the observation corridor adjacent to Containment Suite 9, 2 layers of reinforced material between them. The human was never in any physical danger. The thresh could not reach it, but the thresh could see it, and the human could see the thresh. The thresh went immediately still. Thresh specimens do not go still when they detect prey. They go active, oriented, tracking, pressing toward the signal. A still thresh is a thresh that has detected nothing, or a thresh that is confused. The biometric readout on the human at the moment the partition opened and the thresh became visible. Cortisol analog 119, virtually unchanged from its ambient baseline for the week. The thresh pressed its sensory array toward the partition for 90 seconds. Then it turned away. It moved to the far corner of its transport unit and did not orient toward the human again for the remaining duration of the exposure. Odev Selm quietly from the back of the observation booth. The thresh can't smell it. Not because the human had no stress response at all, but because the human stress response, even in the presence of a visually registered apex predator, was so compressed, so contained within its physiologically normal operating range, that the thresh's sensory system classified it as background noise. Not prey, not a notable biological signal, just ambient. The human watched the thresh for a few seconds. Then it went back to its maintenance logs. I looked at the thresh. Then I looked at the human. Then I wrote in my log, the predator was more disturbed by the encounter than the prey. Day 31, last day of formal protocols. Full battery, the complete record is in evidence, concluding with a comprehensive biometric sweep. Full endocrine panel, neural oscillation spectrum, cardiovascular profiling, thermal signature, muscular tension mapping, everything. The expected result, by any model I had, significant cumulative physiological stress load, an organism whose baseline had climbed substantially from intake, a stress response architecture running hot, a body paying the cost of 28 days under sustained pressure. What we found: cortisol analog, 108, down from 131 on day 17, down from 122 on day 22, below the 109 we had measured on day 10. Cardiac rhythm, 46 beats per standard interval, up 2 beats from intake, stable. Neural oscillation, within normal resting state range during sleep and voluntary stillness periods. Normal elevated arousal during reading and exercise, as expected. Thermal signature, within 1 degree of intake baseline. Muscular tension, within normal resting state range. The human was, biometrically, in better condition than it had been on intake. The cortisol analog was lower. The cardiac rhythm was marginally higher but stable. The neural oscillation showed none of the fragmentation signatures we associate with chronic stress accumulation. The body had adapted, not just tolerated, adapted, as if 28 days of continuous pressure had not broken the system down but had given it something to do, and the body had done it, and the baseline had settled. I sat with those numbers for 6 hours before I drafted the preliminary report. When the tribunal's primary seat examiner reviewed the preliminary findings and asked me whether I was confident in the instrument calibration, I told her I had run full calibration checks on day 1, day 15, and day 30, and every result had come back within tolerance. She asked whether I could rule out species-specific endocrine resistance, a condition in which the receptors that should respond to the cortisol analog compound simply don't. So the compound accumulates but the organism doesn't feel the corresponding stress. I told her that the receptor mapping, validated against 3 separate secondary protocols, showed normal binding kinetics and normal downstream signaling. The stress signal was being received and processed. The organism was feeling it. It simply was not being overwhelmed by it. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "And there's no known mechanism for this." I said, "None that our current models account for. We're building new models." Day 32. After the formal protocols concluded and the restraint protocols were downgraded, I requested a direct interview with detainee 7. I want to explain why, because it was outside my usual methodology. But by day 32, the behavioral assessment team had submitted a review I found inadequate. Their conclusion was that the human had demonstrated unusual stress tolerance and should be reclassified as provisional sapient pending further review, and I believed the record needed something more than a classification recommendation. I needed to understand the inside of the data. I entered the containment suite for the first time in 32 days. The human was seated on the sleeping platform, reading from the data tablet. Medium frame by human standards, calm face, the expression I had come to recognize across 32 days of feed monitoring as its default, which I can only describe as composed attention, not performing composure, simply composed, the way a surface is smooth when there is nothing moving underneath it. It looked up when I entered, set the tablet down, waited for me to speak first. I sat in the observation chair. I introduced myself. I told it my name and rank and the nature of my role. The human said, "I know who you are." I said, "From the observation cameras." "Yes, you're the one who watches the numbers." I said, "I want to ask you some questions if that is acceptable." It said, "Sure." I said, "During the study period, the 31 days of formal protocols, did you experience significant distress?" The human considered this, perhaps 5 seconds before it answered. "I was uncomfortable," it said. "That is not the same as distress," I said. "No, it isn't." I said, "The sustained acoustic protocols, the sound." "Annoying," it said. "The sleep disruption." "That one was harder, I got through it." "The level 4 environmental protocols, the combined disruption." A pause, then, "That was unpleasant, I won't pretend otherwise. The no pattern thing, the unpredictable schedule, the random light changes, that's a good one." It said this without evident anger, more like someone reviewing a technical problem, a good one. But unpleasant isn't the same as breaking. You'd have to go quite a bit further to actually break me. I looked at my notes. I said, "What is quite a bit further?" The human looked at me with an expression I did not immediately classify. I have since classified it as the look a person gives when they have been asked a question by someone who has not yet grasped the scope of what they are asking. It said, "I don't know exactly, I've never found it. I've had things in my life that I thought would break me and they didn't. So I stopped assuming there was a bottom. There might be, I just haven't seen it." I wrote this down, not because it was a biological finding, because it felt important, and experience has taught me that when something feels important in an interview, you write it down. I said, "The neural trace during your stillness practice, the slow oscillatory pattern." "Meditation," it said. "You can call it meditation." We did not have a category for it. Our catalog of sapient voluntary regulation states has 18 species cataloged. None of them matched your pattern. "You should add one," the human said. I said, "The thresh, on day 28, the predator specimen." Something shifted in its expression then, the first time across 32 days of observation and one direct conversation that I saw something I could not read immediately as simply composed. Not fear. Not quite. Something that preceded fear or sat alongside it and had been dealt with before it could complete. "I saw it," it said. "You showed no physiological fear response. The thresh could not register you as prey." A long pause. The human looked at the tablet on its knees rather than at me. "I saw it," it said again. And this time I understood that the repetition was not an error, it was the full statement. I saw it. I registered what it was. I processed what it was. Everything that might have followed, the fear, the spike, the biological alarm, had been caught by something and held still. Not suppressed in the sense of pushing something down. Processed. Handled. Finished with before it became noise. I sat with that. "One last question," I said. "The maintenance logs, you read them for 6 hours." The human almost smiled. There wasn't much else to read. "Were they interesting?" "Not remotely," it said. "But bored is better than scared if you have a choice, and I had a choice." I stood. I thanked it for its time. I walked out of the containment suite and down the corridor to the observation booth, where Saratdim was sitting at the console running the final data compilation. She looked at me and said, "Well." I sat down. I looked at the day 32 scan results on the screen, the cardiac rhythm, the cortisol analog, the neural oscillation signature, all of it clean and settled and quiet. "Bored is better than scared if you have a choice," I said, and they always seem to have a choice. Saratdim did not say anything. I said, "File the reclassification, full sapient, not provisional." She pulled up the form. "The behavioral team will push back. They'll want more review cycles." The behavioral team can review all they like. The biology is already decided. What the biology showed, and what I have now testified to in full, is the following. The human cortisol analog reached a maximum of 131 nanounits per measurement volume on day 17. The baseline intake measurement was 63. The final day 31 measurement was 108. The species median resting range, as we can now determine from the available physiological literature, is between 50 and 180. We ran 28 days of designed adversity against a creature that experiences our maximum sustained protocols as operating within its own normal range. That is not the same as saying it did not feel anything. It felt everything. It said so plainly, uncomfortable, harder, unpleasant. The biological signal was present and genuine. It simply did not translate into crisis. The organism received the input, processed it, and returned to baseline, not because the input was not real, but because the distance between input and crisis is, in a human, orders of magnitude larger than in any species we have previously profiled. I have a hypothesis about why. I will offer it to the tribunal as a hypothesis only. Because the mechanistic work is not yet complete. The human species is, by the evidence of its own evolutionary record, extremely old. Not old in the way some galactic polities are old. I do not mean institutional longevity. I mean the species itself has existed and been sapient, or nearly sapient, for what their own fossil record suggests is several 100,000 years. And for most of that time, by their own historical account, they were not the dominant organism in their environment. They were prey. They were small and slow by predator standards, and without natural armor or venom or acute sensory advantages, living in landscapes full of things that could and regularly did kill them. They survived anyway, not by fleeing every threat because they were not fast enough, not by avoiding stress because their environment was continuously stressful. They survived by staying functional under pressure for longer than the pressure expected them to, by continuing to think and plan and cooperate and act while everything around them was designed to make them stop. The thresh encounter illuminates this, I believe. The thresh hunts by detecting the chemical signature of prey fear, a signal that evolved in prey species because acute fear produces the biochemical cascade that prepares a body for flight or combat. In most prey species, this is essentially automatic. The predator is perceived. The system fires. The compound releases. The thresh has been optimizing against that signal for, presumably, as long as both species have coexisted. But consider what happens over hundreds of thousands of years if your primary survival mechanism is not flight but endurance. If fleeing is not reliably available. If the only dependable survival strategy is to stay functional, stay coordinated, stay capable of tool use and collective action and deliberate response, all of which require the higher cognitive functions that acute fear suppresses. The biology, over sufficient time and sufficient selection pressure, would trend toward containing the fear response. Not eliminating it. The signal is information. It tells you something real is present, but catching it before it floods the system. Processing it rather than being processed by it. The humans evolved in the presence of predators that hunted them. They were not always as they are now. At some point in their history, in some population of their ancestors, individuals who could contain the fear response while remaining aware of the threat, who could see the thresh and think rather than run, survived disproportionately. Pass the architecture on. The architecture refined over generations until what we see in the biometric readout is not suppression but calibration. The difference between a system that prevents a signal from arriving and a system that receives the signal, processes it, extracts the information, and returns to function. This is what I believe we measured. The residue of several 100,000 years of selection for exactly this capacity. I will now address the question this tribunal was convened to consider. I will answer it the way a scientist should, with the evidence as the foundation. The question is, are humans dangerous? Individually, a human is not, in raw physical terms, more dangerous than many species we have cataloged. Absent tools or weapons, a human is large and strong by herd-prey standards, but a specialist predator of comparable mass would typically have physical advantages. The question the tribunal is actually asking is not about individual physical confrontation. It is about what it means to engage with a species whose stress-response architecture operates this way. What it means over time, in the kind of conflict or competition that spans months or years rather than hours. And to that question, the data provides a specific answer. A species that does not break under sustained pressure is still functioning when everything else has broken. When the conditions have exceeded every tolerance threshold for every other actor in the engagement. When the pressure has gone on long enough that the reasonable strategic assumption is that the opposing organism has exhausted its capacity to respond. When your own forces are running cortisol analog levels that impair cognition and motor function and decision-making. Because that is what sustained adversity does to a nervous system operating normally. The human is still at 108. Still reading. Still exercising. Still sending careful, polite messages asking whether the calibration error in your timing system is intentional or a hardware fault, because it noticed, and it wants you to know that it noticed, and it is offering to help you run a cleaner study. Not because it is indestructible, not because it cannot be harmed. It can be harmed. It can be killed. It has limits like any biological organism, but the ceiling is high enough and the endurance beneath the ceiling is deep enough that by the time those limits are approached, any opposing force operating on a normal stress response curve has long since passed through its own limits and out the other side. You do not beat a system like that with intensity. Intensity is what it was built for. You would need duration in excess of the human's own capacity, and the evidence suggests that capacity is very large. I submitted my full report to the Institute on day 40. The addendum on day 53, after the comparative neuroendocrinology team confirmed that the voluntary regulation state we observed is not rare in the human population. It is common. It is teachable. There is evidence it has been practiced in various forms across the full known span of the species' recorded history. Thousands of years. They have been deliberately training this capacity in themselves for thousands of years, refining an architecture that evolution had already spent several 100,000 years building. The addendum's central conclusion. We initially framed the study as an inquiry into the human stress response architecture. What we actually documented is a species that has spent most of its existence field testing and refining a single survival system, and that has, somewhere in that vast span of time, crossed a threshold we had not previously mapped. The threshold between tolerates stress and integrates stress. Other species tolerate, they endure, they wait out the pressure and recover afterward if they can. The human takes the pressure into its operational architecture and keeps running, not despite the pressure, not after the pressure, during it. The pressure becomes, in a sense, the conditions of normal function, and the human adapts its normal function to the conditions, and the baseline stays quiet and the instruments rest. I have no further testimony to offer at this time. I yield the record to the tribunal. I will say one last thing, not as testimony but as an observation. The kind a researcher makes when they have spent 32 days watching a sapient being adapt to conditions designed to exhaust it, and then sat in a room with that being and asked it what it had felt. The human told me it had been uncomfortable. It told me some days were harder than others. It told me the no-pattern protocol was a good one. It told me bored is better than scared if you have a choice. It told me it had sent that message on day 20, the one that said it was not angry, that it hoped the data was useful because it meant it, and because it saw no reason not to say it. I have thought about that last sentence a great deal since day 32. What it means to be the kind of organism that, in the presence of a well-designed adversarial environment, orients primarily around maintaining a choice. not escape, not defiance as an act of resistance, just the preservation of an internal state that the outside environment cannot reach. The instruments read what they read because the state was real, not performed, not the product of a species that had learned to mask its stress markers. We checked for that extensively and found no evidence of it. The state was genuine. The human had found, somewhere in its history or its training or simply in the way it had been built by the pressures of its own past, a way to remain itself under conditions that unmake other selves. What the instruments read as rest may not be rest in the way we usually mean. It may be something more like the stillness of a system so thoroughly calibrated to pressure that pressure registers as weather. A condition to account for, to work within, to not be consumed by. Something that passes over the surface and does not change what is underneath. I wrote in the margin of my working log on day 1, instrument fault. By day 32, I had a much better word. I still have not written it down. I am not sure our language has one. I want to return to something. Because the tribunal's third-seat examiner raised it in the preliminary review, and I addressed it only briefly at that time. The question of prior studies, whether any data existed before this proceeding that should have altered our baseline assumptions about the human stress response architecture. The answer is yes, and I will account for our failure to incorporate it. There are 17 published survey papers on human physiology available through the Galactic Survey Authority's Xenobiology Registry. Of these, 12 were filed under unclassified sapient, the same designation under which our intake documentation was processed, and as a result were sorted into the lower priority registry tier that my department's standard literature review protocol does not routinely sweep. This is a documentation failure that predates my tenure at the Institute, but I am not raising it to assign blame. I am raising it because the pattern those 17 papers show, even in their preliminary and often poorly structured form, should have prompted a different set of initial assumptions on my part. Of the 12 lower priority papers, 7 contain biometric data. 3 of those 7 include stress response profiles taken in field conditions, not controlled studies, but observation data from human populations during extended periods of environmental adversity. 2 of the 3 specifically note anomalously low cortisol analog markers relative to the conditions being observed. One of them, filed by Survey Officer Gretvan of the 11th Outer Survey Mission, contains a note in the appendix that reads, almost verbatim, subject population observed over 90-day period of resource scarcity and extreme environmental conditions showed no measurable degradation in cognitive performance or social cohesion, with endocrine profiles suggesting the population experienced the observed conditions as moderate rather than severe stress. Gretvan had flagged this anomaly with a notation recommending follow-up study. The follow-up study was never requested. I have reread Gretvan's appendix note many times since day 32. The thing that strikes me most is not the anomaly itself, which, in retrospect, is entirely consistent with what we documented, but the word Gretvan used. The population experienced the conditions as moderate, not that the conditions were moderate. They objectively were not. Gretvan described them as extreme. But to the biology, operating through whatever architecture the humans have built over several 100,000 years, the subjective registration came back moderate. The environment said severe. The human body said moderate. The body was not wrong. The body was translating the input through a filter that Gretvan had no framework to interpret, and so the notation went into an appendix and the follow-up was never requested. And 11 years later my junior colleague ran our intake panel and wrote instrument fault in her field notes, and I told her to run it again. I include this for the record not to diminish the findings of this study, which I believe are significant and correct, but because the tribunal asked me whether I believed humans had been deliberately concealing the nature of their stress response architecture from the galactic community. My answer is no. The galactic community simply was not looking carefully enough at what was already there to be seen. The humans, as far as I can determine, have not been hiding anything. We have been insufficient observers. I want to return to the physiology, because the tribunal has asked about mechanism, and because the addendum's mechanistic section is dense, and I want to make sure the key findings are clearly stated in testimony. The voluntary regulations state, what the human calls meditation is the most operationally significant finding from a strategic perspective, and I want to be precise about what it represents biologically. In the 18 sapient species for which we have cataloged voluntary regulation states, the mechanism in every case is essentially inhibitory. The higher cognitive centers generate a suppression signal that dampens the activity of the arousal pathways. Think of it as a gate being lowered. The stress signal is blocked before it can propagate fully. This works, and it is why we have cataloged it in 18 species. It provides real physiological benefit, but it is costly. The suppression gate requires active maintenance. The higher cognitive centers must continue generating the inhibitory signal for as long as calm is required. If the underlying stressor is severe enough or sustained long enough, the maintenance cost eventually exceeds what the organism can afford, and the gate opens, and the arousal floods through all at once. Crisis, often fast. The human's voluntary regulation state does not match this architecture. The neural trace during the human stillness practice does not show elevated inhibitory signaling from the higher cortical regions. It shows something else, a low-frequency, high-coherence oscillatory pattern distributed broadly across the neural network, with the stress pathway nodes running at their own characteristic frequencies without phase locking to the arousal cascade. Not suppressed, decoupled. The best analogy I can construct for the tribunal, with apologies for its imprecision, imagine a room full of instruments, each playing its own note. In a normal stress response, the alarm systems of the body are essentially a conductor standing at the front of the room, forcing all the other instruments to follow its tempo. Arousal rises, and the whole system locks in step behind it. In the human's voluntary regulation state, there is no conductor. Each system runs at its own rhythm. The alarm is playing. It is playing clearly, but the other systems are not following it. This means the human can receive the stress signal in full. It is not numb to the threat, not blind to the danger, while the rest of the body's operational architecture remains available for other uses. Thought, planning, fine motor control, communication. The things that are first to go under normal acute stress, because normally the alarm conductor demands all resources orient toward immediate threat response. The human has, through a practice refined over thousands of years, and apparently encoded deeply enough that it registers as neural habit rather than effortful override, found a way to keep the alarm and the orchestra running simultaneously without one dominating the other. The thresh encounter is almost a perfect demonstration. The human saw the thresh, the alarm played, the body registered, apex predator, genuine threat, information this specific comes from deep instinct. And then, and this is the part that matters, the orchestra kept playing. The higher cognition kept running. The voluntary regulation pathways kept the rest of the system decoupled. And the net biochemical output, summed across all systems, was 119 nanounits. Background noise by thresh olfactory standards, not prey. I do not know how long it takes a human to develop this capacity. The literature suggests years of practice, building on a baseline architecture that the species has already refined over evolutionary time. It is not universally present. We have some data, still preliminary, suggesting significant individual variation in the depth of the decoupling. Some humans appear to manage it more readily than others. Some appear to develop it under pressure, as Detainee 7 appears to have deepened its practice during the 31 days of protocols. As if adversity itself, given sufficient endurance beneath it, becomes a training environment. The tribunal's secondary seat examiner asked me, in the preliminary review, whether detainee 7 was exceptional, whether it was a trained individual, a soldier, or a specialist, or someone selected for particular psychological resilience. I told her I don't know. We did not have access to detailed biographical data. What I can tell you is that the communication log, the behavioral observations, the physiological profile, nothing in any of it suggests an organism under unusual strain. Nothing that would indicate detainee 7 was doing something its species would consider extraordinary. It adapted. It read maintenance logs. It asked careful questions. It sent a message to say it was not angry. It meditated. If it was a specialist, so may be most of its kind. And if it was ordinary, then the ordinary human is something we need to significantly revise our models to account for. That is the finding I would most like the tribunal to take from this testimony. Not the peak measurement of 131, which is dramatic but ultimately a single number. Not the Thresh encounter, which is vivid but anecdotal. The most significant finding is the final day 31 scan, read in full, and the understanding of what it means. A body, after 28 days of sustained adversity, that is in better condition than it was on intake. A baseline that moved up by roughly 70 units across the entire study, peaked at 131 on day 17, and came back down to 108 by the end. A system that, given sufficient duration, not only maintains but adapts, recalibrates to the new conditions, finds its equilibrium and settles. The organism did not merely survive the study. In some measurable biological sense, it was prepared by the end of the study to continue. I have filed the full mechanistic analysis and the updated species profile with the Galactic Survey Authority's Xenobiology Registry under the Permanent Sapient tier. The profile now includes a notation in the Strategic Advisory section, which I wrote myself and which I will read into the record here, because I believe it belongs in the testimony as well as the file. The notation reads, "Human stress tolerance architecture presents a categorically distinct threat model from any previously cataloged sapient species. Standard adversarial containment and attrition strategies predicated on cortisol analog accumulation and cumulative physiological load are unlikely to produce the expected results within any strategically useful timeframe. Any engagement with this species that relies on sustained pressure as its primary mechanism should be considered, on the basis of current evidence, unlikely to succeed against a motivated and prepared human population. The architecture does not degrade under sustained pressure at the rate any prior model would predict. It adapts. Recommend that future strategic planning incorporate this finding as a baseline assumption rather than an anomaly." The director of the institute reviewed that notation and asked me whether I was overstating the findings. I told her I had been conservative. She approved the filing without further discussion. I yield the record to the tribunal. I have nothing further. One thing I did not include in the filed notation, because a strategic advisory is not the right place for it. On the last day of the formal study period, after all the protocols had concluded and before I had scheduled the day 32 interview, I sat in the observation booth alone and watched the live feed for approximately an hour. No active protocols, nothing running, just the human in the containment suite, in its evening period, in its stillness posture, in the low light of the regulated cycle. The biometric feed showed 107 nanounits, cardiac rhythm 45, neural oscillation in the slow, decoupled pattern I had come to recognize. I had spent 31 days applying every stress tool my institution has to an organism that was now sitting in the same room I had placed it in at the beginning, physiologically quieter than when it arrived, apparently undamaged, reading borrowed maintenance logs and meditating in the evenings. The honest scientific response to this, I believe, is not alarm. It is not triumph on the human's behalf either. This is not a competition, and the human was not in one. The honest scientific response is simply to sit with the magnitude of what the data describes, a species that spent several 100,000 years being hunted and came out of that time having built, inside its own biology, a system for remaining functional under conditions that would stop anything else. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just still there, still 107, still reading, still waiting with composed attention for whatever comes next. I wrote in the margin of my log on day 1, instrument fault. I still have not found a better word for what it actually was. The instruments were never at fault. They read, faithfully, an architecture that was operating exactly as designed by evolution, and by practice, and by whatever it is in the human experience that has, over a very long time, produced this. The tribunal has the data. The tribunal has my testimony. I believe both speak clearly enough.